Hello, this is Leah Janikowski, and this is my video tutorial for CEP 560, Learning and Instruction. The skill that I've decided to learn for the learning project throughout the semester is watercolor painting. I decided to learn this because it's something that I've attempted to learn in the past, but I've given up very quickly. So, a little bit of my background, I do have an art degree and I was classically trained in oil painting, which actually has been quite a hindrance to learning how to watercolor paint. So, oil paint is very thick, it has the texture of frosting, and it's very easy to control and modify if you find that you want to change something in your painting. For watercolor painting, according to the book I read, the paint should have the texture of milk. And it also dries almost instantly when on the paper, especially for the first layer. I would say my first layer of my painting was dry in under a minute. So it's very difficult to go back and change things once they're on the paper, which has led to me throwing out a lot of paintings because I've tried to fix mistakes that I've made and ended up punching a hole through the paper. So watercolor painting typically occurs in 3 different phases. You can see that I already have paint over the entire paper. That's because I've already completed the first phase of the painting. During the first layer, you want to box in colors and shapes so that you know where everything is. So you can see that you can differentiate between the beach and the grass, but there's not a lot of details. I just tried to get in where the specific colors were and where the lights and darks are. So currently in this video, I'm working on the second layer. I'm only going to be completing the sky in this video just because of time limitations, and I'm sure you guys don't want to watch a 45-minute video of me painting the second layer. But in the second layer, you bring in more color variety. You want to differentiate within the colors different shades. So you can see that I'm bringing in deeper reds and darker grays into the clouds, and just a little bit more detail than in the first layer. You're still not doing the very fine details, like if I wanted to add texture to the grass down below, that's something that I would do in the final layer, which I will not be showing you in this painting again just because of time restraints. Also, something that I'm doing in the second layer is I am making the shapes more clear. So that's a lot of what I'm doing in the clouds is I'm blurring the edges, because in the first layer I just wanted to get the gray onto the paper. But obviously when you look at clouds in real life, they're not these very defined shapes. They have blurred edges and they like fade, and some spots of the cloud are more opaque than others. So I'm trying to bring that into the clouds a little bit more. The very fine details again will come in during the third layer. A little bit of the behind the scenes of what I am doing. So I started with I think around 8 or 9 different colors on the palette. So I have to paint fairly quickly because the watercolor paints, I am using tube paint, and as soon as I put them on the palette they begin to dry. So you have to work fairly quickly to mix your colors, and I tend to mix my colors as I paint rather than mixing them prior, just because if I take the time to mix them prior, by the time I start painting everything is dry. So I typically, as I mentioned, start with 8 or 9 colors, and then if you count all the colors that I mix, I'd probably end up with around 15 or 16 for this painting. So you'll notice that the painting is tilted up. I have it that way because for watercolor painting you want to encourage the movement of the paint. It's what makes watercolor painting so unique and beautiful, is that the paint is very free flowing. It's also one of the most frustrating things for me coming from oil color painting because honestly the paint kind of goes where it wants to go. Something I also learned during this process is about the materials that I should use. So currently the paper that I'm painting on is taped to a piece of cardboard to keep it flat. Some issues that I run into is that the paper that I bought buckles really easily. So basically it folds into itself and the corners turn in as well. And it makes it really difficult to view the entire picture unless I have it taped to a firm surface. So, after talking to some people online, it's apparently because the paper that I'm using is fairly low quality, only because I didn't want to buy super high quality paper when I was learning. But in the future, I want to go out and buy thicker paper. So, the reason the buckling happens is because the water soaks into the paper fairly easily, and obviously, when paper gets wet, it buckles and curls into itself. So, fairly simple answer, but something that I didn't know before starting this project. The brushes that I'm using currently are synthetic. The book that I read on watercolor painting recommended using, I think it was brushes that are made out of like squirrel tail or something outrageous that I didn't want to invest in, and I'm not quite certain the ethical principles of using squirrel tail brushes, but I am using synthetic brushes. I don't really have any complaints about them, but again, I don't have any experience using more expensive watercolor brushes. So for watercolor painting, you can either use tube paints or you can use a pan with paints that are already in the palette. I chose to use the tube paint only because of my prior experience. I'm used to being able to mix my own colors and getting the specific colors that I want. So I thought that was a better option for me, but I know I have a friend who sells watercolor paintings who prefers to use the pan only because the colors are more concentrated and it requires less time mixing and you don't have to worry about your mixed colors drying once you mix them, which is something that I've been dealing with. As I mentioned, I would mix all the colors, and then by the time I was ready to paint, my paint would be dry, and trying to re-wet it, you didn't get the same quality as using the fresh paint. So I am finishing up the second layer of the sky here. Just as a little bit more detail of what I would do in the third layer is I would try to bring out the brights and the sun more. You can see I have the yellow in there, but it doesn't necessarily have that shining quality that you see when you look at sunset photos or um, more realistic photos of sunsets or paintings. Also, one of my favorite things about watercolor painting is being able to add splashes of color. So I usually like to finish up my paintings with a nice little splatter of like red or something bright across the painting. And here is the final second layer of the sky. Thank you for watching.